Hi everyone, I'm Anne-Marie Towers. I'm the ASCOT Programme Lead, and I also have a particular interest in how we can use ASCOT with care home residents using a mixed methods toolkit. So we get a lot of questions about the different ASCOT measures, and there are some other videos on the website to take you through an overview of these. Today I'm particularly going to talk about the mixed methods version. So the Mixed Methods Toolkit in care homes has exactly the same service user domains as all the other measures. So starting with the basic down at the bottom here, food and drink, personal cleanliness and comfort, accommodation cleanliness, personal safety, the higher order domains, social participation, occupation and control over daily life, and also importantly that dignity domain. So like all the other ASCOT measures, the Mixed Methods Toolkit has 4 outcome states per domain. So it covers the ideal all the way through to high unmet needs. Now usually those of you who've used the other ASCOT measures will know that these outcome states are conceptualised as response options in an interview or questionnaire format, and the person would normally be self-responding and would tick whichever response option best corresponds to how they feel. However, in care homes it's quite different. Sometimes people can't tell you because of severe and complex needs such as dementia about their own quality of life. And in those cases we have to think a little bit outside the box. And so what you'll tend to find if you look through the research literature is that there's a variety of ways of doing this. One is to ask a representative, so we often call this proxies. Another is to carry out qualitative interviews, but this may only get partial information. The other is to undertake an observation, but this only gives you a snapshot. It's not going to provide you necessarily with the full picture. And the final one is to use a mixed methods approach, which is essentially a combination of them all. So what we do is if you want to use the Care Homes Toolkit, we will train you to collect evidence in the following ways to inform your ratings of the residents' current and expected social care rated quality of life. So first of all, we will collect the resident's perspective, and we will do this in whichever way best meets the needs of that particular resident. So we offer a whole range of different resident interviews, from very structured interviews all the way through to qualitative with prompts, and then simple conversational tools where you might only be able to ask the resident about the here and now, such as, do you like that sandwich that you're eating, or are you enjoying this activity? We also train you how to use structured observations. As a general rule of thumb, what we expect is that you will undertake the observation in a 2-hour window, usually up to and including lunchtime, so that you can get information around the food and drink domain as well as some of the other domains. And it's not 2 hours per individual resident, it's 2 hours for every 5 residents. So we would expect you to recruit at least 5 residents in a care home to your research study, and then one of you could be observing 5 residents and the other person could be in another room observing another 5 residents if you wanted to. But 5 residents for every 2-hour observational period. Then the other thing that we do is we train you to undertake staff and family member interviews, and these are structured interviews very similar to the INT4. So they ask about current and they ask about expected, and we recognise that these are proxy perspectives which are different but still add something to the evidence about that resident's social care related quality of life. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, here's an extract from a qualitative resident interview for the food and drink domain. So the interviewer: what's the food like here? Resident: delicious. We had chocolate cake and ice cream for pudding today. Interviewer: oh, that sounds nice. Do you choose what you eat each day? Resident: yes, we can sit down every day and choose from a menu, and if there's nothing we fancy, they always offer to make us a sandwich or something else. Interviewer: I noticed that some people had a glass of wine with their meal yesterday. Oh yes, some do. Totally up to you. I don't, because I'm not really a drinker these days. I prefer juice. So you can see here how a very qualitative interview can start to cover some of those really important things within the food and drink domain. Is the food to the person's preferences? Do they have a choice? they've clarified something that they'd observed previously. So they'd been in the day before and noticed that some people were drinking wine and others not. So they've used this as an opportunity to follow up on some of the questions they might have had after their observational period. Here's an example of some observational notes. So this is structured observations, and you can see that it's that sort of late morning going up into lunchtime period. And you'll see that the times are written down with some notes about exactly what the resident was doing and what was happening at that time. Notice the time gap, 10:50, 11:15, 11:30. That's because in between, the observer would have been making notes about other residents as well. So you rotate around the residents that you're observing. So 10:50, the person was in a chair in the bay window in the lounge, sleeping. Legs are up on a stool and a large cushion behind her. The reason these notes are quite detailed is because these are the sort of thing that will feed into lots of different domains. So here we've got something around the environment, so that would be accommodation, something around personal cleanliness and comfort. Do they look like they're comfortable in that chair? But also the occupation domain. What are they doing? They're not doing anything, they're sleeping. And here we go next. The next observation was at 11:15. In the chairs before, half awake, dozes, then looks around, then back to a light sleep. No interaction with the 3 other residents in this lounge. That's important for things like the social participation domain. So she's surrounded by other residents, but they're not interacting. There's no social participation happening. Still napping at 11:30. And then at 10 to 12, they're awake and they're sitting in the lounge, but they're the only person there. And they're moving their feet in time with the ticking clock. And earlier she told the manager how bored she was. So again, feeds into the occupation and the social participation domains. The person is not doing anything, they're saying they're bored. 12 o'clock, still alone, looking out of the lounge window as she eats, so not even been moved into the dining room to have a meal with all the other residents. 12:15, still in the chair but eating pudding. So we know that they're eating their lunch, but we know that other parts of their quality of life are not so great. Checked back in the afternoon at 3 o'clock, so this is outside of the normal observational period. Notice they were in the same chair in the same lounge. So it starts to give you a sense of this person's life on that particular day. Here's an example of the staff and family interviews. So this is for the food and drink domain. Thinking about the food and drink that Mary or whoever it is gets, which of the following statements best describes how you think resident's name feels about his or her situation? And this is where they give their perspective. I think he or she feels that they get all the food and drink they like when they want, adequate food and drink at okay times, doesn't always get adequate or timely food and drink, doesn't always get adequate or timely food and drink, and there is a risk to her health. So it goes from the ideal state all the way down to high unmet needs there at the bottom. And importantly, you'll notice there's space for notes, and that's because when we collect this information from staff and family members, we're really looking for them to, yes, give their perspective and tick a box, but also we're picking up some really useful kind of qualitative information as they talk around these domains. Often they can provide quite helpful additional context to things that you've observed or things you might have had a chat with the resident themselves about. So then it's time to take all the evidence that you've gathered in your time in the care home about each particular resident and use that evidence to make a rating of social care rated quality of life. So you need to front and foremost be thinking about what the resident told you. What's their view? Because in an ideal world, this is a quality of life measure and we'd simply be asking them for their perspective of their own quality of life. We accept, though, that in this case it might be partial and it might be more conversational, as opposed to a very quantitative tick box exercise. Then let's look at the observational evidence for each domain. What did you see? What was the person's lived experience? Did you follow it up with questions in the interviews? Hopefully you did. So you might have seen something and not quite been sure how to interpret it. Hopefully you then had a chat with the resident about it, like that. Do you remember in that resident interview you said, oh, I noticed some people had wine yesterday. So you've seen something, you wonder if there's much choice around that, how people make choices around that, you follow it up in the interviews. Family and staff interviews, these are really important perspectives. and they can sometimes be at odds with one another, but they can also provide really helpful context, especially for the expected domain, which can be very hard to rate in care homes if you don't know the residents' ability to look after themselves and meet their own needs very well. So this is where family and staff can be really helpful. And then you use that information to make a rating of current social care related quality of life and expected social care related quality of life for each of those domains. And together, these can be used to calculate a gain score and estimate the impact of the service. Now, just to think about why this method is important. So what's the impact of using this mixed methods approach on inclusion? How does it improve your sample size or your missing data, for example? And to talk about this, I'm going to draw on two studies. The Measuring and Improving Care Home Quality Study, or MyCare, which was funded by the NIHR Health Services and Delivery Research Programme, and also Measuring Outcomes of Care Homes, or the MOOCH study, which was funded by the NIHR School for Social Care Research. Now, I'm going to have a look at what data we collected on each resident across the two studies and how many of those residents would have been excluded had we relied exclusively on self-report. So let's have a look. 475 older care home residents took part across the two studies, and about half had a diagnosis of dementia. More had cognitive decline. Using the mixed methods approach that I've just described, we managed to get ASCOT scores, current and expected, and therefore gain, for all 475 residents who had no missing ASCOT data. However, had we relied exclusively on resident interviews, for example, we would have actually had the opposite. We would have had mostly missing data. So of all of the ASCOT domains, the easiest domain for residents to talk about in the current social care related quality of life, which is all we ask them about, is the accommodation domain, which is something very concrete and something that is quite easy to talk to residents about. And even then, only 31.6% of the 475 residents were able to do a kind of quantitative self-report interview. And if you remember, to get an overall ASCOT score, you need a tick in the box for every one of those ASCOT domains. Without that, you can look at it at the domain level, but you can't look at that overall ASCOT score. So if that was the best domain, and we had less than a third that completed it, that gives you an idea of just how much missing data we would have had. Now, we undertook those staff interviews, and actually we had a staff interview for every single resident. However, staff didn't answer every single domain for every resident. So actually what we ended up with was around 91 to 94% response rates per domain. So again, if we'd only relied on the proxy perspective, we would have had a big sample size, but we wouldn't have had a completely comprehensive perspective. And equally, we would have only had the staff view, which of course is important, but is different. Finally, we managed to only speak to 10% of families. Where we did, they did tend to answer all the domains, but only 10% were able to come into the care home to undertake an interview. Now, we think this is methodologically a bit of an issue, and it's largely due to the fact that in the past, and for these two particular studies, we tried to speak to family members face to face. So we tried to ask them to come into the care home while we were there collecting data to take part in an interview. Since COVID-19, everybody's got more used to using things like Zoom, Teams, undertaking video calls. So we think that in the future, one of the things that we'll try is undertaking these family interviews using that kind of technology to support fieldwork. And we hope that this will mean that we'll get a greater response rate from family members in the future. For those of you who are interested in reading a little bit more about these particular studies, the report will be out soon. I've given you a link there to the journal that it will be published in, and we're expecting at some point in 2021 that report to become publicly available. Okay, so if you're interested in using this version of ASCOT to measure social care related quality of life of care home residents, the first thing to say is that we do highly recommend training. You need to be really familiar with the ASCOT domains to be able to use this toolkit well, and you also need to be able to understand what the different levels of outcome look like for each of those domains so that you can translate observational evidence into ASCOT ratings. You have to be able to gather evidence and make a judgment about social care rating quality of life, both current and expected, and that can be tricky and it does require practice. So it's always a good idea, if you're going to use this in a research study, to maybe have 2 or 3 of you collecting this evidence, and that you can work together, be trained together, maybe do some inter-rater reliability calculations together, and really discuss any difficult or tricky ratings that might crop up during the study. Normally we run a 2-day training course at Kent for this, but obviously due to COVID-19 we're having to rethink this, and what we're thinking of doing is trying to translate the 2-day face-to-face course into some kind of online training. We're going to try and turn our attention to this over the summer of this year, so watch this space. Okay, thanks for listening everyone. Just to draw your attention to this disclaimer, because I have reported some findings from those 2 research studies. So just to note that the views expressed here are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the NIHR, NHS or the Department of Health and Social Care or its arm-length bodies or other government departments. If you're interested in finding out more, then contact the Care Homes ASCOT team, which is myself, Anne-Marie Towers, or my colleague Nick Smith. Thank you for listening.